I want to thank Humber College for organizing such an event. It's not just for academia, people who are students, etc. It's for us NGOs to hear and learn from each other. So can we give a big round of applause to the Humber team? So I don't profess here to close this session and tell you all what's needed for next. I wish I knew. I haven't a clue. Let's face it. So what I'll do is basically bring my practitioner perspective as an NGO for so many years in the field and the work we do here, and also my academic experience of teaching in different universities, and think what is needed next. So again, these are just my thinking at this stage, and there's a lot to be done. So please don't expect any great visionary words coming out in the next 10 minutes. So I wanted to bring a couple of slides before we go into what next, into a couple of the big things that have happened in development in the last 2 decades. Of course, the whole idea of GDP, and the other one is Millennium Development Goals. I'm not here to debate and argue what these have achieved or not achieved, but the fact remains, it galvanized attention among the governments, it galvanized attention among the donors, among the academia, NGOs. So it successfully brought all the practitioners under these heading. And as I said, we'll not go into the fact of what it didn't achieve and not achieved. Likewise, the GDP, we have debated whole day today what GDP is, and as some of the commentators mentioned in the morning, GDP is just an accounting measure. To expect it to measure everything, that's not right, and we learned that today. So I think all of these bigger indicators and the goals that were set up in MDGs, etc., tried to measure something, but we cannot say they measured everything. But again, the reality is what gets measured, gets reported, gets attention, gets funding, gets implemented. So I think whether we like it or not, these indicators have tremendous power, they have tremendous importance. The second one, the second slide I want to talk to you about is what's happening right now, because the MDG is actually officially ending in July, August, and there'll be new sets of goals, the Sustainable Development Goals. And we still don't know what these goals will be. There's a lot of debate, a lot of discussion. And on May 30th May 2013, there was a high-level panel discussion on post-MDG development goals. And some of the key big items that were highlighted in this report is from the UN is leave no one behind. And I want to reiterate this again, and I think it came out in the discussions in the morning. When you have national level figures, whether it's GDP, whether it's MDG, you are measuring one figure. And that's the average, that's the mean. It does not measure the distribution, it does not measure the people who are either too wealthy or too poor. Of course, we as NGOs and practitioners of development are concerned with that side. They don't get measured, we get one figure. So that has been a huge weakness. So this question about leaving no one behind is very important. We talked about sustainable development at the core. What is sustainable development? A lot to be discussed. How to transform economies, but most importantly, how can it include those people who have been left out of development gains? What we call inclusive growth. Building peace and effective and open accountable institutions, and forge a new global partnership. Again, these were very broad themes that have been put out prior to the SDGs coming out. So what are these sustainable development goals? Again, nothing has been finalized or formulated yet. There's been a lot of debate and discussion. And what is interesting in this is the first discussion actually evolved into 17 goals, 169 targets. Imagine measuring that. And I'll go into that again later on. So the reality is, this is a great time to debate this because we are thinking about what next in the next 2 decades. So I think this session today and the presentations actually start thinking for the next round of development topics that we need. So what are these challenges going forward based on what we heard today, based on what I see as a practitioner? So my apologies, you will see more of a practitioner perspective than of a policy level at the top, because that's what I'm bringing from my experience. The first one I want to highlight again is development is complex, requires multifaceted approach and expertise. I think this whole notion of somebody going and just putting a tablet or just giving an injection, that's not, that's not development. I think that needs to be acknowledgement. Oftentimes, the general notion in public or in media or even in certain academic sectors, there is that development is very easy and this is it. Give them something, drop some food, and we are done. I think we need to get that mindset out that this is a long haul, it is a very complex, and it requires expertise. Expertise doesn't necessarily mean PhDs, etc. Expertise means people listening to the people who are impacted by it. The second point, I think, it comes out from our work again, is comprehensive approach to development, I think, which the Prime Minister has mentioned and many others have mentioned. It works. But let's not again forget it takes time, it takes money, it takes expertise. And I will bring the equation of money. People don't want to talk about money, and we didn't talk much about it. But if there's no one funding or supporting these kind of programs, these will remain as brilliant papers on the, and we have seen that again and again. So I think we need to be a bit more pragmatic as well. GDPs, again, I brought this point again because I think as an NGO practitioner, to us, with whom we are trying to work with the most vulnerable, the women, the marginalized, they've failed us, both the GDP as well as the MDG target, because they are national figure. There's one figure. They hide the inequalities. Even in middle-income countries, the upcoming middle-income countries like Brazil, India, Colombia, there's a huge group of poverty. Even in countries like Canada, among the Aboriginal population, in US, among the Black population, there are huge pockets of poverty. By talking about one figure nationally, I think we are doing pure injustice to those people who need service or care, whose voices are not heard. So again, the poorest, the most vulnerable, the marginalized, the women. I mentioned women as we have heard today as well. The whole gender equation, putting one figure hides that debate. The last point here in this slide, I want to again bring to attention that there have been brilliant, perfect projects, as we call them. A lot of these brilliant, perfect projects, including us, we NGOs tend to do this. How do you scale them up? What is needed to scale them to the broader population? And what is needed? What kind of research is needed? What kind of support, discussion thinking is needed? There's no short and dearth of perfect projects. I think we need to, going forward, start thinking about the whole scale-up issues and way to reach more people. Again, my second slide. So again, no nuggets of gold. I'm just putting some points for us to think through as you go back home and think about development challenges. And these are opportunities too, so I don't want to leave in a very negative note. The systems approach, I think that's also another important thing. We talk about sustainability. This has become a buzzword in development. You give $10 and everything is sustainable. Give something and it becomes sustainable. But I think we need to unpack the word sustainable. What does it mean? What does it mean in a systems approach? How can the ownership be with the governments? The local governments, the national governments, the governments who are receiving aid on the beneficiary side, as well as the developed countries. What does that mean? The second point that I really wanted to highlight here is this whole notion of chronic emergency. There's a lot of media attention. We are seeing that in Nepal now, and rightfully so. But there are long-term or chronic emergencies, as we call. They lose media attention, nobody pays attention, the donor interest dives, but things are not solved there. And just some of the examples, this can be natural or it can be man-made. The natural ones are such as food insecurity. For example, in the eastern horn of Africa, on the east side, these countries such as Zimbabwe, Tanzania, Ethiopia, they're chronically seeing every year food shortage. Yet they make media, they get donor attention, they get government attention when you hear a very sick child of a dying child. But the reality is this chronic continuation of, whether you call it emergency or that situation, it continues on. We talked about chronic malnutrition. It's because you're not getting three meals or the full meals going forward day in and day out. That seems to fall off the radar. What about the man-made conflicts? We don't hear about Darfur. Darfur was the topic of 8 years, but things haven't changed on the ground. We have programmed people working on the ground. Nothing has changed. It's just that it has lost favor from the donors. It has lost favors from the government. But there are thousands and thousands of people still living in those camps. So what about this chronic conflict? So what kind of development discussion, solution needs to have for these people who are like forgotten people? Another point, and as a demographer, I really want to bring to the attention is the whole demographic shifts. Are we paying enough attention to it? For the first time in the history of the world, we have a huge number of youth here. What we call in demography the youth bulge. There are thousands and millions of youth who are semi-literate, have little information, knowledge. There are no jobs waiting for them. So it's no surprise when, and people like us, I have a son here, 16, 17-year-old, he has nothing to do, he'll pick up guns. He has nothing else to do, he will create gangs, etc. So it's no different in other parts of the world than here. So who is thinking about this demographic shift of youth bulge? Second, for the first time in the history of the human population, there'll be more people living in urban population than in rural. And this is going to be happening in this decade. All the time you read in development articles, it's all about rural poor, rural poor. And the urban poverty is a huge different dimension. There's no food to be grown, there's no water access, health care, no voices to be heard, they're mobile. So again, urban migration. So it's not about refugees that's moving from one country to one country. I'm talking about within intra-country. What about the development needs? And the population growth. People are showing a lot of statistics in rates and numbers. It hides the numbers. Then a country with the 2% of population, which is 100 million, has a huge number of people than in sub-Saharan Africa, where the country could be small and have a smaller number of population. So I think we need to understand the rates, the proportions, and the actual numbers. Where are these poor people? Where are these vulnerabilities, and what's happening to them? So I think demographic shift in development studies, I don't know how much it is being taught in the new universities, and this, I think it's a very important topic to have discuss this and to understand what these indicators mean when you talk about rates, proportion, and numbers. Role of social media. Nowadays, even a person, even remote villages, areas in Sierra Leone, was there a few months ago, people may not have toilets and water, they do have a cell phone. They have access to information. That kid in Sierra Leone, in remote part, knows quite a lot about his surroundings than any of us do, even though we say we are practicing. What is the role of social media and connectivity? People are engaged. The role of citizens. I think these are the issues we need to tackle in development. And again, last not the least point here is the whole innovation. I love innovations testing, but again, I bring this scaling up the solution. High tech, something coming from outside that cannot be fixed, that cannot be run locally, cannot be sustained locally. We need to think as well. Another slide. I think we had a brilliant panel on measurement. I think I, again, want to highlight that. What to measure and who is measuring? We talked about a lot of stats, but we know very well in developing countries, the Department of Statistics, the Department of the Health Management Information System, the part of the Ministry of Education that collects education data are the poorest paid. Many of them are not paid, and the frontline workers who collect data, actually, in many countries are volunteers. So what kind of data are you expecting? So when we talk about national data, we need to understand. And the capacity. And just to give you one example, even in Canada, when we were trying to recruit people with M&E expertise, we had real difficulty. We don't get people who have expertise, and same in country, we can't afford them because there's so few of them in country. So who collects, how to collect, and what is the government system collecting those data? It's great to have UNICEF, it's great to have demographic health surveys, but these are external bodies collecting the data once every 4 years and 5 years. The local government makes decision on programming, on what to do based on the government data, which we know about the quality. So I wanted to throw that in the challenge again. But I think there's a great opportunities there as well. And also the lack of indicators. I think we discussed about indicators, and Bhutan is a great example on how to develop comprehensive indicators. I'm afraid not many governments are interested in this kind of comprehensive indicator. But what is it that is fairly simple that can be measured? And I put that easily, not to downplay that, because it can be at macro level, it can be at district level, sub-district level, but it has to be something the local governments can measure themselves and not wait for outside funding to do so. So I think that is also important for those of us who are in academia. We need to have good measures and indicators that can be measured. One of the last bullet points I wanted to put again in thinking is, we have had this whole architecture, the funding architecture, for the last 2 decades, and this whole system of UN aid coming from outside, from the rich countries, actually came after the Second World War. We're still using that model. I think it's 60, 70 years after the Second World War? Is this relevant anymore? What is the role of NGOs, even in developed countries? What is the role of local NGOs, academia, etc.? And the private sector, of course, and the role of donor recipient. I think it served a purpose for certain years, but maybe after so many years in this work, you can hear some pessimistic voice here, because we are talking about the same issue. And I think I had a lunch with Ian Smiley. I consider him my guru. And we had the same discussion. He said, oh, I heard that in 1960s. And here I'm still talking about media attention of Canadians being in Nepal. Why does it have to be a Canadian to be in Nepal to do development? Surely Nepalese are not stupid people. They know development. The local people, just like in Bhutan, they are smart people. Why is it that they need to be rescued by us all the time? I think we need to ask these questions, and the whole issue of sustainable development. How do you build local capacity that they can sustain and they're not waiting for us to be rescued? I think the best development is when you, all of us are needed, and that I'm out of the job. That's what I would like to see going forward. Thank you.